Hello and welcome to the next episode of Have We Thought This Through, and also welcome to Norfolk in the winter. I've been about a year away from doing this series, and I've been thinking all the while about what this next series would be about, and I'm looking forward to making it over 2026. But I'm going to kick this one off with an episode called Why Oh Why, which is a bit of a deep dive into why questions. As anyone that's seen any of my videos will know, I'm pretty obsessive about questions. I've been a pain in the bum asking questions my whole life, and I really love why questions, but they do need a little bit of exploring and deconstructing somewhat. They obviously have incredible power because they can help us create explanations and identify the reasons for things, but there's plenty to think about when designing why questions. And I think I want to, obviously, with this series, put all of this in the context of the distinctiveness of our human intelligence and what that means for our relationship with artificial intelligence and our use of it. So, first off, one of my favourites is having encountered this in my reading of Daniel C. Dennett's books, which anyone that knows me will probably be bored of me recommending them, but I've become addicted. They're thrilling philosophical rides. So the key here is he looks at why questions in two particular flavours: how come and what for modes. And a good weird example is this question of, why do humans have opposable thumbs? So obviously there's a how come version of that question, which is perfectly legitimate to ask and answer. And we might say, well, there's been a whole series of genetic mutations over many, many human generations, and that there's been evolutionary pressures over time, which has meant that the opposable thumb has become a winning trait in today's humans. Another version of answering that same why question is to say, well, what for? Why do we have opposable thumbs? Could now be answered, well, we use them to grasp and manipulate tools, interact with our environment, and be able to tell people that things are good in the world. Funnily enough, I then shortly encountered a completely different approach to the why question in Robert Sapolsky's book, Behave. And the interesting thing about this why question, or this sort of format of the why question, is it's incredibly expansive and it's a little bit giddying at first. So essentially, Robert Sapolsky talks about this idea of thinking of why questions as kind of like time slices, and that we are sort of detectives going back through time. And so we might have a question around, like, why did someone lash out in anger? And of course, there will be many, many ways that we might interpret this. But we might start by saying, well, let's just think about the nearest thing we can think about. What were the micro activities that were occurring just before this lashing out? What were the stress hormones that were playing a role? What were all the different kind of systems in that person's body? How were they activating? What was going on there? What signals were being sent? But then we might go, well, okay, well let's go out a little bit further in time. Let's go a little bit before and think about the minutes before this lashing out. What were the kind of provocations or social cues? What were the kind of behavioural contexts? And we might set that in a psychological or sociology type of a context. We might go further out again, and we might think about, well, in terms of the span of this person's life, might we understand something about long-term childhood traumas? Might we think about the kind of wider cultural context that this person's living in? And so we now have this kind of third circle of time that we're considering that why question in. And of course, we can go further still, and we can start to think about the long-term evolutionary design that has led to the success of human beings that are able to lash out. That is actually in some ways a designed-in advantage that has been developed over time through evolutionary stresses. So you can start to see that what we end up with is this kind of sequence of whys moving back through time, but also shifting through domains at the same time. It's a really, really interesting way of thinking about it. So another one I just want to pick on quickly is this concept of the 5 whys. Now, many of you will have encountered the 5 whys in all sorts of contexts. It's yet another one of these weird things that seems to have evolved at Toyota. This time, right at the inception of Toyota, around the 1930s. Sakichi Toyoda was really interested in how to think about an engineering problem through the application of 5 whys. It was felt that, 5 felt sufficient enough to be able to get to the root cause of a problem. And the reason why this was so significant was this idea that you could, if you didn't do the 5 whys, what you were likely doing was solving the kind of surface considerations, the surface features of the problem, and that there were deeper causes that needed to be addressed through engineering. And it became so successful, it got embedded in as a kind of cultural and working practice at Toyota. Almost was frowned upon if an engineering group hadn't done 5 whys. Well, you needed to go back and do the process properly and come back with some answers. But of course, then what happened, and it happens a lot, with Toyota's ideas, like the agile approach, is that it sort of became a wider practice used in wildly different contexts and really taken up by consultancy groups around the world. And the interesting thing about 5 whys is that it has some intriguing implications when you start to apply it to non-engineering type problems. So a good example is the idea of thinking about why questions as a sort of layers of meaning in the world. So for example, you might think about a particular problem as a societal problem. So you might start at the top and say, okay, yeah, there is inequality at the society level. Why do the proponents of society behave in those ways that create that societal problem? Let's think about the psychology of those individuals. And then after that, having dug through the psychology, you might say, well, I think there might be a deeper place for the answers here, which might be in the kind of neuroscience and the biology of the minds of those people. And that might lead you to think, okay, yeah, we've understood a little bit more about neuronal activity that leads to this set of behaviours, which leads to these kind of net and aggregate effects at the society level. But let's go deeper. Let's think about the chemistry that underpins that neuroscience. And let's go deeper and let's think about the physics that underpins that chemistry. And then let's go deeper and think about the kind of the maths, and let's call it the informational layer that might underpin all of that. You start to see that you end up with this very interesting stack of domains, with each one potentially purporting to provide answers for the one above. You can start to realise that with 5 whys, you actually just can explain one phenomenon in the context of almost any other. You realise that you can start to explain things in almost any way, in any order. You can chase the whys all round the map, which is quite fun and sort of ludicrous. So the 5 whys approach often goes pretty weird. There's all sorts of things that can happen. You can have something really interesting occur, and this happens in consultancy, where you're asking your 5 why questions, and by the time you've got to the bottom, you realise that you might have found an answer right at the top of the stack again, and you've found yourself in a loop. And you realise that you're not really explaining things in a kind of axiomatic way. You haven't got to the bottom of things. And obviously the other interesting thing is that there's a kind of infinite regress issue, right? You start wherever you might start, let's say a societal issue or a business issue. Let's think about a business issue in particular. And you might be wondering why this particular business line is really successful and this one over here is being less successful. And you can start with that. And then you ask yourself a whole bunch of questions, and you find yourself getting to a point where your explanations have gone too deep in the stack of layers, that you've started to explain things in terms of the foundations of the industrial process, or the mechanics of a thing, and the engineering of a thing, and then into the physics of the thing, and all of a sudden you're like, oh, hold on a minute, I don't need to understand it at that level. As Daniel C. Dennett points out when he's thinking about the kind of infinite regress problem, it's unlikely that the table of elements is going to have much to tell us about the success and failures of a corporation in the marketplace. And that was Why Oh Why, a deep dive into why questions. And I just wanted to finish up with thinking about how we could potentially use our AI and our LLM tools in combination with humans to really dig into and extend the kind of range of why questions that we can apply to something that we're exploring. So, we might well want to get our AIs to generate us a whole set of different alternative 5 whys that might explore the domain shuffle that I was talking about earlier on purpose. We may want to have a go at Sapolsky's time slice why approach and really get our AI tools to give us a provocative set of responses from microseconds out from an event all the way back through millennia, mostly because it's going to trigger new thoughts in us. And actually we might want to try Daniel C. Dennett's multiple flavours of why approach, and just realise that what we're trying to do is map out a whole landscape of potential why questions, rather than land on that first one that seemed sensible. Okay, that's enough of that. I hope some of this has provoked some thoughts for you, and hope to see you in the next one.